Witam Państwa serdecznie na
Ladies and gentlemen, we're here for the last panel discussion today, and this will be dedicated to public transport. That's one thing, but then the icing on the cake will be a paper about the Emilia Plata battalion, but we will come to that. So I am Tomasz Przerwa. I work at the University of Wrocław, and so as not to waste time, I wanted to give the floor to Dr. Waldemar Brzostowski from the University of Gdańsk. Well, paper pushers, note keepers and conductors, women in Gdańsk public transport in the years 1945-1951. Thank you for the invitation. I hope it's not only because we express solidarity with the Polish coast. This is the slogan we see here on the wall, referring to the 80s there, but Gdańsk is similar to Wrocław, just like the two cities are similar to Szczecin, so not entirely, actually. And I wanted to mention that what I work in my field is public transport, but of course I'm interested in trams, in buses, and all sorts of routes, but I'm also interested in this other komunikacja, as we said, which in Polish also means communication, not only public transport. And I'm interested in people. Gdańsk was heavily destroyed during the war, and some neighborhoods were destroyed nearly entirely. And this happened, for instance, in the downtown, this main city, because Gdańsk does not have an old town. The old town is a totally different place, but not the city center. But some quarters were not destroyed, such as the quarter of Wrzeszcz, which took over the administrative functions. Sopot is a different city altogether. Gdynia, next door, where the first editorial office of Dziennik Bałtycki daily newspaper appeared. And so, well, public transport was key there to connect all the dots in Tri-City, and public transport was emerging quite rapidly at the time, and what emerged very rapidly was the issue of displacement, and that process also progressed very rapidly indeed. I believe that the attachment of Poles to Gdańsk, stemming, for instance, from books such as that by Ashkenazi or other books published before the war, or visits of journalists, all led to the kind of treatment given to Gdańsk by Poles. They treated it as their own city. This is our own city, Gdańsk, it's Polish. And two books published in 1947 in Gdańsk. One a research book by Marian Pelczar, The Polish Gdańsk, and another one was a guide by Jan Kilarski, a guide to Gdańsk, entitled Gdańsk, Our City. So this again confirms that this was indeed the case. Poles treated Gdańsk as their city. Now the two companies I wanted to mention, MZK and ZKGG. So I'm talking about municipal transport companies. Gdańsk Transport Company and the Inter-Municipal Transport Company. The first one was established in April 1945, and it operated until 46, and its successor operated from 1946 till 1951. And you can see here, this is not an actual picture. It's about this route, but not necessarily on that day. But on the 28th of June 1945, a tram rolled out on the streets of Gdańsk. The streets of Gdańsk, where 134,000 people were living at the time. Before the war, 250,000. Gdańsk will come back to that in the late 1950s, but at that time that was 134,000, of them 124,000 Germans. So Gdańsk was still German at the time, and I talked about this pace of the displacement campaign, but this will gain momentum only at the end of the year. In late October, early November, this will be more or less 50-50 Germans and Poles in terms of percentage. And you can also see a kind of template with a name of the street, which is still the template is in one language and the name is another language. So now the reconstruction of the city, that was the previous slide, but I'm interested mainly in personal dossiers and files, personal files of actual people in the company archives of the two companies. And I studied around 3,500 of these files, and this is a unique database with information concerning people who came to Gdańsk and who stayed there, because some of these people were Germans or people who had arrived from the direct vicinity of the city. So I'm talking about three groups, and sometimes people use stereotypes and they say that they were basically barefoot village bumpkins, lazy Ruskis, and Volksdeutsch people. And actually, those groups were not that numerous. But we have people coming from areas in the direct vicinity, from Pomerania, more or less. But they were defined as, Volksdeutscher, and I'm one of them. Well, in those terms, I'm from another generation of the Volksdeutscher. And so we have these bios in the archives, in the files. We have these personal sheets, cards, and all sorts of documents from the daily lives. And I developed an interest in something I'm going to talk about. I developed an interest in women working in this company. And it results from the census that in the Gdańsk voivodeship, out of 116 women, there were, 116 women to 100 men. So the number of ladies was greater. And so this also manifests itself in very simple statistics concerning those years. It's about the company itself. It's a transport company, so we should not be surprised by the fact that it employs more men than women. And some departments, however, were more dominated by women than the company at large. And there, the first women were managers appeared, obviously with more unmarried women, and around 70% are women aged less than 30. So we have a very young community, a community of very young people. And as far as the professions, the women chose three functions were available for women. The first one, and the most numerous one, was the function of a conductor. Another one was a clerk, so basically a paper pusher, note keeper, financial department employee. And the third group was educated women, and women who for some reasons, for various reasons, were treated, well, not so much badly, but for some reasons they were underprivileged. Widows, for instance, German women who had stayed in Gdańsk, and they could hope for work in cleaning, in the cleaning department. There was a special department for housekeeping, basic maintenance, and whatnot. So women were generally better educated than men. Even if you look at the breakdown into the individual departments, the women would earn less also. So that's the sad reality. And with this upper secondary education, we have as many as 74 women. And indeed, those women were later promoted within that company. They went up the ranks. And so we have the kind of housekeeping and construction department, the cafeteria department, or the canteen department. So an important element of remuneration was actually food, and some of the ladies were employed in the catering department, in the canteen department. They would peel potatoes on a mass scale, and there was also a pig pen and a vegetable patch right next to the company's buildings, and so they would do that. And also the backup facilities, so the German women, widows, and often there were some women who experienced rapes during the war. That's a terrifying statistic. Around 50% of women in Gdańsk had experienced rape, had been raped, and they had all sorts of STDs. At times there was a Swedish mission operating, so there was talk about that doctors work. So those women deprived of men, and often other women who were also young. They applied for the job because they were poor. They had nothing to eat, so they asked for help. And conductors. This is press info. Conductors find a husband easily. So that was perhaps supposed to encourage ladies. If you have any doubts, there's a film by Aleksander Munk, Niedzielny Poranek, Sunday morning. There's a short film, if you like Warsaw, is worth seeing. It also encourages women to become conductors with the hope of finding a husband within the company. So, among those ladies, it was actually interesting how they had to pass their exam to become a conductor. They had to write a short essay and about what transport is for me, why I came here to the Polish coast, and this is linked to the fact that a conductor, a ticket inspector especially, they were supposed to describe some dramatic situation. Someone didn't have a ticket, or someone had actually cancelled the ticket not correctly, so they had to file a report. Hence the need to pass this exam. Office workers. The first managers appeared as office workers, and so the first managers were not necessarily people representing some high standards in terms of education. That's interesting. Although these ladies will have secondary education, but they will be wives of party officials, of party activists, and for instance, Wrocława Zakorska, the wife of the deputy mayor of Gdańsk. And they will be managers in the financial department. And one can say that the financial department, I'm not saying that a dynasty will be founded there, but the ladies will basically run this department for a long time. So, activists. The Women's League, that was usually the activist department in any company, and my impression that comes from these internal in-house documents of the companies is that they sought to organize, women's soirees and all sorts of meetings, and to conduct courses, and they would encourage others to attend them. Courses organized by the local craft chambers, usually about typing, and all sorts of office work. Now, within the company, if we talk about 3,500 employees, we have a kind of world within a world, and they work together, they have fun together, they go on holiday together, and they organize some theater together, and they stage plays. So Janina Staszewska-Ćwiklińska ran it, an actress coming from Vilnius. And that Vilnius milieu in Gdańsk is kind of mythologized, such as the Lviv milieu in Wrocław. But our mosque, for instance, in Gdańsk was actually run by Tatars from Vilnius. So there are some elements of that. So the early socialism period was a rather puritanical period, and so all sorts of bad behavior could result not only in an official reproach or an official reprimand, but one could be put up on the board of skivers and of people who are harmful to the society in general. So that was really, there was no censorship in the local, kind of company paper, so one could see anyone in a situation that was not very, very favorable, and nobody censored that. It was actually printed in the press. So, so I believe that that is better to even apply self-censorship. So, for some women, actually, for quite a few women, marrying meant that they would interrupt the work, or they would no longer work, and I put some quotes in here. Because I married, I have my duties as a wife. I intend to work in my household and to devote myself to raising children. Well, if the marriage went fine, then all things would be good. But then I do encourage you to read my article where I describe the situation of women who, for various reasons, were abandoned by their husbands, and you might be aware of the fact that they had little experience in work. So after 6 months or a year in 1945, 1946, there was a standard. Then they married, and if the husband abandoned them, well, they had little experience to take up work again. People often change their significant other, or they change their place of residence. Someone wrote, "Oh, I met an American guy during compulsory work. He was nice. Now I have 2 kids, and I don't have the money to get by." So the situation of these women was actually quite unfavorable. And if you're interested, you can read more in my article. Now, some housing was prepared for women who had to combine work and married life. So also a kindergarten was prepared, which could have 70 to 100 children, and that was quite a curious idea, actually, because well, the kindergarten is right, that's understandable, but in Warsaw there was a special tram that would kind of gather the kids from the different neighborhoods, because it's not that simple. The public transport was in its initial phase, and for quite a long time it also had this navigation department and was part of the structure. And now we had advertising. We had actually ads for jobs such as the seamen and also tram drivers. So actually Germans used to do that job, and the same goes for seamen. So that's why when the Germans left, well, they had to find some new people, and the Germans were not accepted. So basically, Poles were given the job instead. But in the transitory period, the Germans kept doing the job. Then people from Poznań came, people from Warsaw came, and always they put in their applications. 70% of the applications said, "I'm from Warsaw," and that was, enough in terms of recommendations, in terms of credentials. I'm a Pole also, so I'm from Warsaw. It was like, you guys know that I'm from a city that was ruined during the war. And you'll find in some bios of the ladies who would run some outpatient clinics and who would run some gardens. These are also women from Warsaw, people linked to the Warsaw uprising. So we're talking about the period until 1951. Women were encouraged to take over male duties, but that was rare. Karina Rogalska, the first female tram driver, who was indigenous, as they wrote in her application, that she hailed from there. Rogalska from Lviv, Tor, well, probably local. They were among the few women who had the license to drive a tram. Elżbieta Machura, a trolley bus driver in Gdynia, she was she excelled in work as a trolley bus driver, precisely. So these heroines of labor did operate there, and these activities in the early 50s were suspended, consciously and deliberately. And when the so-called thaw came, the situation of the women that started doing these jobs deteriorated, and that was associated, for instance, with the elimination and closing down these teams of women in companies and plants. They were not seen that favorably, starting from the early 50s, and some information started appearing in the press. I'll quote one trade periodical: "Cases of employing women doing work that is not permitted for various reasons are still quite common," and that happened in public transport company and in municipal transport companies and other similar entities. Even more than that, the fact that women were employed by many people unaware of the evil they were doing would actually be presented as an example of equal rights of women and men. End of quote. And so time is running out, as you know, so I will refer to my own family experiences. I am someone who, well, I'm a man of certain age, and I remember my grandfather talking about the ideal of a household in which the man works, but the woman doesn't have to work because she can take care of the kids. And this ideal, well, this surfaced in a sense during the thaw period, and this kind of referred to a society which was very traditional and not entirely didn't entirely accept these experiments, what was referred to as the Eastern experiment. And so this is not a very optimistic note, but on this note I would like to end my presentation and refer you to my article and essentially my research into transport. This actually gains a lot thanks to the personal files, and my impression is that we have protagonists of different stories, we have great figures, we have all sorts of huge processes, but in this whole there are these small little people who live their own lives, and these personal files somehow, when we browse through them, we have the impression of participating in the lives of these people to the extent that the archive is actually right in the building where these people worked. I know exactly where they worked, in which room, at what time. I know even what they looked like. So I could say that I would recognize them in the street. And it happens sometimes that when I take the tram and go somewhere, sometimes after looking through 150 or 200 photos a day, I actually recognize some of these people on the tram. So it all goes full circle. Thank you for attending, and thank you for the invitation.
Pięknie dziękuję za niezwykle interesujący referat.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. As you've mentioned, it was indeed not an optimistic ending. However, I believe that it was, after all, ended up with a optimistic note. The human perspective is still something that should keep us going in terms of our scientific and historical research, being able to actually link individual events or facts with some phenomena, well, used to be incredible. Now, Karamafi, a doctoral student of the University of Warsaw, I also believe, University of Wrocław, repatriation versus motorization, individual and national fleet of cars in the first months following the Second World War in Lower Silesia. Thank you very much. Because on a daily basis, I actually study a pre-war automation, automotive industry, motorization, and the stock of cars. I would like to start by saying that I would like to handle the post-war motorization, let's say, phenomenon. And since this conference, the entire conference is devoted to men and women, to people, well, actually, my presentation is also about men to a certain extent, but there will be something out of an ordinary because we are focusing so much about people, we tend to take the vehicle for granted. So the main protagonist of my presentation would be the said vehicle. Very briefly using some figures, but if you like to read my article, you would definitely get a more humanist approach. So let me start by saying that motorization is something that was of an extravaganza. It was something that not everybody could afford, obviously, and motorization during the Second World War became something completely different. It was useful, it had its function, because, well, vehicles were used to obviously carry weaponry, ammunition, everything, virtually everything that could be transported using rail or road transfer. So the position of a vehicle, of a car, was really well grounded. But we are mainly talking about, well, heavy vehicles, because it was the lorries that used to deliver all the goods and commodities, for instance, to railway stations, because they were to be placed somewhere. So individual transport was this unwanted child, especially in the new reality of the communist, sparking communism, when a driver or owner of a car was not too welcome, not to mention a luxury individual means of transport that enabled you to travel on your own. So let's focus here, or let me focus on the biggest curiosities of that time. Actually, two worlds functioning in the first post-war months. And I'll get there because one could not register an individual car not until April, May 1946, while there were cars with chauffeurs and private drivers roaming the streets of Wrocław. So let's imagine what was happening then. Okay, but let's start with repatriation. Let's start with displacement problems, because that's precisely the perspective of vehicles and individual cars through which we are going to perceive this. Obviously, this Wild West we are going to talk about, and I'm not going to duplicate the cliches, was somehow legally framed, even though it came to Poland, before it came to Poland. What I mean is that Poles moved to the new regained lands, as the propaganda called it, in order to demonstrate the very potential of Poland and to highlight the very fact that we, the Poles, simply deserved these lands. But how they were placed here? Yes, before we get to means of transport, we have to talk about the automotive sector that was actually at the very beginning tried to be actually put in legal frames, because the legal frames were simply required. In 1944, in Helm, during the military activities on the Second World War, the company of Autotransport was founded rather quickly. That is, in January 1945. It turned into state-owned vehicle institution. It was the monopolist that could do virtually anything in the market. Their tasks included registration of cars, training of new vehicle drivers, setting the motorization policy in the country, defining whether and what and how is to be managed, repaired, and so on and so forth. So that was a monopolist that could afford to do virtually everything. So, in this respect, let's start with those first rather funny cases. You can see a very specific conflict thanks to BUS, the company, as it was referred to. Was a monopolist. It started conflicting with some other, let's say, enterprises or businesses, or anybody that was initiative and could some bigger fleet of cars. The same applied to the company known Orbis. And you can read it here in a table, the Orbis Cars Transport Loot. So from this Wild West, people could bring out and carry those precious artifacts. That was obviously just a part of this conflict, because BUS was accusing Orbis of all the dirty tricks for the very reason that Orbis was one of the first carriers that actually got interested in the abandoned post-German property. Like the burned down buses, they could weld them, they could put them together. In other words, put a few buses and make them into one, thanks to which Orbis, as one of the first, actually owned a fleet of buses that could transport significant numbers of passengers. Anyway, rather capable of driving. Plus, they had the drivers. They signed some contracts with those drivers or chauffeurs who were using their private cars to transport the displaced persons, or and Orbis was actually a very good example thereof. So let's proceed to this starting from this dehumanized presentation of mine, or the introduction thereto. The military people were counting or reporting and trying to obviously come up with the data and the number of vehicles on stock of the People's Army. I'm not going to bore you to death by saying precisely how many of them there were, but let me just conclude or briefly say that it was the repatriates actually, or the displaced persons actually used. They were mixing on the streets with Soviet cars, but the question is where they got those cars from. How come they had this fleet of vehicles? So, to cut a long story short, the main provider of the vehicles for the Polish People's Army was the Red Army. They collected some sumptuous fleet, some resources, namely cars, thanks to the Lend-Lease contract, thanks to which, in the memoirs of the displaced persons, so you can write that they were traveling us with a Chevrolet or Dodge or a Ford, and people think, how come that in post-war time we were just dealing with products from North America? Well, it was precisely because of Willys. It was actually them that transported people using cars such as GMC and Dodge and Ford, Chevrolet Canada and Ford Canada, by the way, were the most frequent vehicles. Plus, the Polish People's Army also had in disposal some property from the German Handley, Hulwagens, Opels, Blitzes, and so on and so forth. The Polish Army also had installed this and gas. These were the Soviet vehicles. However, we are here more interested with these, this directly resettlement or displacement-related stories. Starting from September 1945 until the very last train, the last transporting train, Poland received help of $27.5 million. By sea and by land, we received 18.5 thousand cars, 86% of which were lorries and semi-lorries. So you can imagine that, well, virtually everything that was driving the street, that was roaming the streets in Poland was lorries. The rest being, well, off-road cars. So there was very little place for passenger cars, actually. So what can be said about those cars from the National Army's reserve? Reading the memoirs of the displaced persons, well, they mentioned that the spectrum of the technical condition was very various. Those taken over from the Canadian Army was absolutely decrepit, and they were not fit for driving. You had to repair them on your own. You had to collect the spare parts, and that was actually clear in the Polish society, because people learned how to fix cars using virtually any piece of metal. So we simply had to learn how to make use of that. So that was yet another reason and source we had those cars from. But who actually owned those? Namely, the National Repatriation Office, RUP, the Polish acronym. There are so many different stories related there too, while the very status of that was not described, and the quantitative status of the reserve was not described, was not reported. So when we come to that, even the Pionier periodical on which I base in my presentation, they claim that POR on the 13th of September 1945 held only 160 vehicles. Incredibly law number, as that was an institution that was responsible for the displacement and the displaced being transported to different houses and places of residence for the internal refugees and migrants, hence the role of PUR that could not had enough of those vehicles. At the end of 1945, what was published was a set of data thanks to which we know that there were 19,000 cars in Poland, out of which were 77,000 of passenger cars. And an interesting piece of information, at least for me interesting, very important notion was that there is 19,000 cars. Well, why is it so important? Well, because it wasn't too frequent in a post-war Poland what registration of a car, what the ownership of a car was, and the plans pertaining to those cars, to the vehicles, were very vague. So different notions were being juggled, so to speak. Oh, you can see here quite clearly how the cars from UMRA were traded and turned over every single issue of the Pionier Lower Silesian Gazette. They precisely mentioned all the Fords and Chevrolets, people watching through their windows, willing to watch or touch, or not to mention drive those cars from Umr. Well, this is, by the way, the report from Jelenia Góra, very locally here. But when talking about these things, everybody was precisely doing the same thing while registering the cars and so on and so forth. I also meant here in the Pionier Gazette, maybe not releases, but very short notes, short memos, mentioning the offices to which you have to submit for the registration of your mechanical vehicles. Following 2 weeks thereof, these cars were registered. So there was huge problem also of a research nature, because many historians handling the very first registration following the Second World War end, or the very fact of owning a car, those historians, those researchers also actually tumbled and fell when encountering this terminology, because no one knew whether the given car was or was not registered. So the best case scenario was that of the pre-war owners of cars. But how come there were any pre-war owners of cars in Lower Silesia? Well, from central Poland, people came from holding some documents, some papers pertaining to some cars that were virtually non-existent. And unfortunately, they knew that the Wild West of Poland was this El Dorado of motorization, because everybody could find Opel Kadett, well, in different technical condition, obviously. So not only was there the procedure of looting, but something that was, registration number forging. Well, something that actually survived until late 1990s as well. But that was the origin of this process was actually in 1940s. You simply forged the registration plate in those post-German cars. In other words, suddenly the car got registered. So what was the gist of this registration? According to the ordinance of the Ministry of Transport from 1947, it was in force, from 1937, it was applicable, it was in force, it was never upheld. At the beginning of June 1945, a temporary instruction on registration of vehicles was issued, but it was not a decree or any regulation. In other words, the pre-war law was applicable simultaneously to all the instructions being issued by BUS. So the cars were allowed to drive, but according to the law, actually no one could register those cars officially. So, very briefly coming to the very last item of my presentation, talking about the cars. Yes, obviously I remember the time. So, what was a very interesting thing, what attracted a lot of attention, was the discovered cars. Repatriates, one should stress that, were naive in many cases, and they actually reported on those vehicles found here and there. Unfortunately, the security office got interested in the most interesting vehicles, the most interesting specimens, and they simply appropriated those. So those witty people, those clever ones, could actually either completely change it off, hide it in a shack, or where not, thanks to which actually those cars survive until this day and age. One interesting story that comes to my mind, near the town of Jelenia Góra, one of the structures of a shack was actually the pre-war Tatra T80, an enormous limo, one of the most dynamic cars that actually transported kings and presidents. So what happened to this Tatra? It was bought over by the museum in Topacz. It was refurbished and it survived until the very day, thanks to being a part of the structure of some farmland shack. One more story. A repatriate, a driver. We don't know precisely where from, found in Piłsudski Street, Mercedes W125. Do you know what that is? This is actually one of a few, the most aerodynamic and extreme sport machines that were ever manufactured. The Silver Arrow, as it was referred to in the popular press. It's 600 horsepower, and the only thing that could be installed on board was the wheels, actually, that actually were replaced with those from a lorry. It was tested on the Wrocław motorway, and it actually stirred some significantly disturbed people. The security office got interested in the car, and, well, that's the last time it was seen on the road. Now, a very interesting tidbit from 1929, BMW Dixie, not manufactured but sold thanks to a Wrocław-based dealer, is now held by a citizen of Wrocław, by the way. It used to spend Second World War times in Upper Silesia, but, well, you can clearly see how this post-war property could be dealt with in post-war times, and you could clearly see how the repatriates actually could handle the problems with a lack of means of transport. And that's precisely how I wanted to first encourage you to read my article, and thank you for your kind attention.
Pięknie. Proszę Państwa, nie zawiodłem się w swoich oczekiwaniach.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have not remained disappointed. My expectations have been satisfied. So in our transport-related block of presentations, maybe it's on purpose that we didn't put railways because now there's new research appearing in terms of motoring. So there you have it, something new. And at the very end, last but not least, Joanna Hytrek-Hryciuk from the Institute of National Remembrance, Wrocław branch, and she will talk about women. So we started this block of presentations with one about women, and so now you have about military settlers from the first independent women's battalion in Lower Silesia. The title is, "But women are not or shall not be taught these things." Well, I'm wondering why the organizers put me in this panel, but it's like with the women from this battalion, they just don't fit anywhere. And the more time passes, they fit even less, actually. And so, that's why they fit me in this panel. So thanks for the invitation anyway. So we met, we meet in here to talk about the Emilia Plata Battalion, and I would like to just remind you, for those of you who don't know the story, I'll just show it to you. So I would like this to be a story of something that's outside the official discourse, and it's been quite a controversial matter. So let us go beyond the military and political context. It's hard to avoid it entirely, but as the previous speakers have said, today let us focus on the people and the places, perhaps less on the politics. I would like to show some unobvious source materials, and my heartfelt thanks go to Ms. Grzybek from the National Archive in Wrocław, Bolesławiec branch. These difficult COVID times enabled me to perform this research, and we have 20 minutes, so I will show you the results. And I wanted to show you also the picture of the Emilia Plater Battalion women in pop culture. And the professor asked about audiovisual sources, how historians see them, and how they judge them. So I will refer to that. But briefly about the battalion. So the first independent women's battalion in memorial of Emilia Plater was formed in May 1943. The idea emerged to actually form a women's unit, and this was actually a result of an agreement between the various entities to form this battalion in the Soviet Union. So that was actually supposed to be recruited from former Polish citizens and Poles, permanent residents and citizens of the Soviet Union. So mainly Poles departed after 1940 into the interior of the Soviet Union, and officially it was formed in August 1943. And this will be the only organized women's military unit in the history of the army. So some people some people say it shouldn't be referred to as a unit of this kind, but that's another topic. And in September 43, it counted 740 soldiers, but they used to be moved from and to other units, and they had various tasks. As engineering, warehousing, reconnaissance, or liaison officers, or sanitary departments. And particular attention needs to be dedicated to the company of Fusiliers, that is armed infantry, and they participate in the Battle of Lenino in the autumn of 1943. And so I will keep saying this infinitely, that the men were the commanders. Women actually appeared only at the level of deputy commander-in-chief for political affairs, for instance. Now, after General Władysław Anders formed the army in 43, diplomatic relations between Moscow and the Polish government in exile in London were suspended. Then the offer to join the Polish army was actually in the Soviet Union, was actually the only way of getting out of the Soviet Union. And the idea was not actually strange to form a female unit, a women's unit. And actually the women that were not aware of the fact that 600,000 women served in the Soviet army, but maybe they knew that in 1941 Stanisława Piechowska had presented the idea to General Anders to have this women's military service appointed. It was appointed by an order in January 1942. So what was the motivation of the women to join this army? This motivation is Polish People's Army. This motivation was related to the wish to get out of the Soviet Union. And well, as I said, that was the only way to escape from a place where they suffered hunger, where they worked and toiled, where they worked very hard, and very often they had to look after their deported families. And here we have an example of some memories. We have Jadwiga Kasprowicz, as a 16-year-old girl. She ended up in exile in Siberia. So she wanted to join this army since she went there with her brother and her sister. That was the right way. And but a lot of women had some doubts, and they were mainly worried about their fate, and they were not entirely sure of the intentions of establishing this unit, and they were above all afraid of what would happen to the family they'd leave behind. And very often in these memories we have these doubts about political aspects too, and so they believed that it was the Red Army after all, it's communist army, and the women obviously knew what that implied. But well, they were reassured by, for instance, the order number 8 of 14th July 1943, where here I quote, tomorrow the whole women's battalion will be sworn in, and at 7:30 a.m. There will be a service in the division chapel, and the battalion will march out to the yard in front of the division staff building. And I'm not going to give you the whole report by the chaplain. There was a priest, a chaplain, who had a lot of influence on the women serving in the unit, and he told them about the reality in occupied Poland, and he also encouraged them with his own personality to actually join the army. Religion, by the way, was present in the lives of the women from the battalion. After being demobbed after 1945, Sabina Homińska in her memoir said that, for instance, the women actually stayed in touch with the priest. They asked for baptism for the children and told him about some troubles in their marriage. But, you know, another woman recalls that before the Battle of Lenina, they asked for personal confession, but the priest said there was no time, and he ordered a collective confession, and they were worried whether it would be accepted, and the priest reassured them that it would, so that shows just how big an influence he had on them. And as far as the military route is concerned, of the Emilia Plater Battalion, I just would have to say everything about the whole journey from the Oka River through, Warsaw and then Berlin. But first of all, we need to focus on obvious sources and on individuals, on people. So let me give you a personal account related to Irena Kruszewska, and this is stored in the archives of the Zawadzka Foundation, and we don't have time to discuss whether a soldier is a person of any specific gender, whether a soldier can be described from the point of view of gender or sex, but I wanted to give you some info on the emotions that she might have had, and this really deviates from the image of a soldier of the Emilia Plater Battalion after 1980. Why 1980 is an important watershed moment, I'll tell you later on. May I go on, or are you still reading the slide? On the 25th of May 1945, Michał Rola-Rzymierski, Marshal, issued an order that the battalion be dissolved, and some of the women went back to their families, to the nearest and dearest, and those were the women who had relatives in the territory of Poland in the new borders. Those who came from areas annexed to the Soviet Union, who had families in the Soviet Union, were sent to various places as military settlers, and some of them ended up in Lower Silesia. 200 settlers were referred to a village, was sent to a village near Lubań. And exactly, what was the name of that village? Where were they sent exactly? Well, we have to go back to rather remote history, because when the von Salza family ruled in the Lubań land, that place was called Linda, and as the estate expanded, it was divided in Nieder-, Mittel- und Oberlinda. And after the Polonization of the area, the Niederlinda was called Lipy-Dolne and Platerowo at the same time. But the commune office and the post office used the name Lipy-Dolne, but the school, for instance, used the name Platerowo. And finally, the whole issue was resolved in 1962, when the Prime Minister ordered that the Voivodeship Council in Wrocław adopt the resolution number 22, saying that the locality of Lipy-Dolne in the county of Lubań should be renamed to Platerówka. So this is the village which is referred to as Platerówka. So Platerówka, actually, Lower Silesian reality catches up with Platerówka quite quickly, and here we have an account of a woman who settled in Wrocław, but the recollections are similar. These women are quite quickly, their lives are filled with violence, with constant migrations, and with this tough daily life in a place where which is alien to them in cultural terms. So we felt, I quote, we felt the odd ones out in the village. There were attacks from the locals, and well, we can actually surmise that it's about the Germans, but might as well have been other settlers. We also tended to kind of frighten them off because we were afraid that something would happen to us. And due to our military past and to the fact that they carried weapons, they took part in the displacement of German population. And I quote, there were many families with small children, so we agreed that we allowed them to take everything they needed to continue their lives, end of quote. And this is important info in the context of the film we will discuss in a while. And the women in the battalion, former members of the battalion, formed a board and chose a head of the village from among themselves. And we have the head of the community actually decided to whom the agricultural machines would be allocated, or the farm animals, and so on. Yes, and Adela Żurawska, who has already been mentioned here, she was the one who allocated the machines to women who often ran the farms individually, and she also wrote in one of her letters that after returning to the country, to Poland, as opposed to a certain legend that called members of the battalion privileged women, actually 90% of the cases they had to resort entirely to their own strengths in building the future, which would be very difficult. And they often encountered spiteful remarks about their past in the military, and resentment on the part of the local authorities in terms of providing assistance to them. And there's also the stereotypical view of the settlers as people who are not independent and who are rather incompetent and privileged, as they call them. So maybe this attitude on the part of the authorities led to the fact that the women had to explain why they had, livestock, for instance, explain to the authorities, and why they had certain financial resources. And here's a document from the archive in, obviously, the Bolesławiec branch of the State Archive in Wrocław. And this document certifies that one of the women does not have enough money to pay for her medical treatment. And there was a huge problem, a social problem, because they usually came back in very poor health, and many of them had malaria, which was unknown in this part of Europe, and so they had no financial resources to undergo therapy, simply speaking, and pay for the treatment. Now here another press cutting we can see in an official gazette published by the 7th Lusatian Infantry Division. This says that there is an independent women's battalion in the Niederlinda locality that is the future Platerówka. And here a couple of signatures by these women confirming the receipt of horses allocated to them by General Popaski, and that was also the reason for certain interventions from the Powiat Starosty, and they had to explain where they got the horses from, and if they couldn't explain it, then they were ordered to pay, or if they accounted for that, they had to pay a special tax anyway. So that's the document concerning this tax, and it all shows us that the reclaimed territories, well, in inverted commas, one might say that they did not give a very warm welcome to the women from the battalion. And one of the settlers actually explains where she's got the livestock from, so she calls witnesses to testify that indeed that was her property. And this might seem trivial to you, but bearing in mind the realities of Lower Silesia after May 1945, having any livestock at all was actually fundamental in its importance. Now we should stop a while before passing to the conclusions. We should talk about the personal lives of of the women from the battalion. We talked about health, but I would like to point to the fact that the settlers often described the problems related to not being well educated. Some of them had only a couple of years of primary school, and they were deported to the Soviet Union as early teenagers. So they were associated with rural areas, and they had little opportunity to actually improve their existence in a way. So this fact of the willingness to study, to learn, they often kind of handed it down to their own children, especially daughters, and they were willing to engage in community life. And they struggled with health problems, but this did not hinder them from being active in the Women's League and Zbowit and the Association of Fighters for Freedom and Democracy, and also social life. And many settlers in a personal survey compiled by Zawadzka say that the marriage is decent, it's going quite well, but also info. Mother died in Siberia. Father is old and ailing. Together with two younger siblings, he came back to Poland. So we had to look after them, send them to school. My big brother died on the front in Warsaw, and we were demobbed with my sister, and we had to look after all of them. Just wanted you to draw some preliminary conclusions from today's presentation and say that I believe that the women from the Emilia Plater Battalion proved that the history of the military is also a history of women. I guess, well, you will perhaps find this banal, but many people just don't realize it. And I have to say that they were quite a unique group, a group that stood out, and their organizational feature was their gender, precisely, and the fact that they joined the military was determined by the fact that they were women. So their migration to Lower Silesia marked the beginning of their new life and the beginning of operation of a new organizational unit, but also this was a burden for them, this new life, and for their nearest and dearest. And often this argument was cited against them because they said that, in conditions of peace it would not work, and obviously they were not allowed to talk about their past. So this is the kind of, apparent equal rights, but only seemingly, and we don't see that in the history of the Emilia Plater Battalion. We would very much like to see genuine equal rights, but the lack of proper education didn't allow them to start some appropriate work, and they had to find self-fulfillment, and they struggled all the time with deficiencies of all kinds and with shortages, and they asked the Association of Fighters for Freedom and Democracy for some financial aid for renovation of their house or for some other funds. And now concluding, really, just wanted to tell you about a very interesting thing, namely the reception of the women from the battalion in pop culture. And this is mainly a film which in 1979, directed by Hranim Przybyła, was released in Polish cinemas, and that was Rzeczpospolita Babska. It was called The Republic of Women, more or less. So the plot is about this rivalry between a mainly a village dominated by women and a predominantly male other village. And I'll, spoilers ahead, those of you who haven't seen the film, it all ends in a big wedding. People get married all over the place. And so a book has also been published about their military route, speaking of their apparent sexual services, which they apparently rendered to soldiers from the Polish People's Army. So these are two extreme cases. One is a comedy, the other is a dramatic work, really. But this is just the binary way we approach this topic. Either it's one or the other. So just wanted to show you one full judgment of their achievements, and this is something which appeared in the 1980s, when they emerged again as a topic. a lot was happening around them at the time. And, well, yes, in 1985 in Kołobrzeg, the band Primo Voto got a special mention for its song called Platerówki about this particular battalion of women who fought at Lenino, and they are given advice that they should go to the kitchen and stand guard there. And well, I believe that this is actually the conclusion we should draw from this, that they need to be retold, right, using perhaps the different tools or historians' tools that keep appearing. Thank you.
Dziękuję pięknie. Proszę Państwa, to wezwanie do nowej narracji. Myślę, że
Thank you very much. Well, with regard to this new narrative, we keep hearing this narrative. Somewhere we rest on what we know, what we think we know. And then we realize that they are myths to a large extent. We have time. I understand you may feel a little tired, but still there is time for some discussions, obviously. If you have any questions, raise your hand, please. Hello, I'm Milan Sochańska, the Regional Museum in Lubań. I'd like to draw attention to one, or even two things actually. The museum, which when its reach actually covers the district of Lubań, including the Emil Plater Battalion and the Platerówki town. There is a very interesting photograph, a woman partially dressed in a uniform, a soldier's uniform. It may suggest that it actually protects her, even though it causes her problems, with all the baggage of problems that pertains to garments and, well, whatnot. And there is also something else, also in kind of a presentation with a very extensive commentary of Professor Steinhoff on YouTube, which I recommend to you because the members of the battalion and the inhabitants of the Platerówki village actually live with this Soviet, and the women that still are alive, their memoirs were recorded and they are actually available on YouTube. So obviously, I suppose that was, yes, let me just add that the very remembrance of the Emil Plater Battalion is actually, thanks to schools, a lot's being done by the museum in Lubań, plus there is this reconstruction group, as it is referred to, organizing picnics as, in June this year. But the broad awareness of the members of the Emil Plater Battalion is something that is missed. It should be reworked once again, definitely. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? Semila Cesniurek, fascinating subject. Still a lot to be done with the members of the Emil Plater Battalion. I encountered this group first. Now, the self-definition of this group, to what extent they actually adopted the narrative of military settlement, do they call themselves settlers, military settlers? To what extent were they using the term repatriates as other displaced persons or repatriates or migrants? And to what extent their experience was truly different from that of other men and women that from Siberia, from the eastern borderland, went to the western regained lands, well, metaphorically speaking, suffering from malaria.
Bardzo dziękuję. Cieszę się, że pod strzechy trafia temat platerówek.
It gladdens me a lot that this subject is actually being discussed. How they identify themselves, they were very strongly linked to the military, and based on documents from 1980s collected by Rana Żurawska, there are some extensive fragments, pieces, where they describe their own identity, telling that their families were actually proud of their military past. They always stressed being military settlers. Obviously, I haven't reached all the sources. There's still plenty of work to be done in this respect, but I think they've accentuated the very fact of how they got to be here in Lower Silesia, how they were transported here. But their story differed, their narrative differed from this of others, of men, because how they managed to get here was important. The very category of gender was important. The fact that they were to a certain extent exiled was also very important. The fact that they were treated with discontent by the then settlers or those whom they encounter here in Lower Silesia, it all combined created the very narrative of the members of the Emily Platte Battalion. By the way, why were they treated with this? Why they were taken for granted? Why they were unwelcome here? I think it was a matter of stereotypes to a certain extent. Also, it was due to this very stereotypical perception of these people, as in the aforementioned film, The Republic of Women, the English title being, plus the flag they were carrying, or for whom they were fighting. So we don't see in this entire narrative individual stories of individual members of the battalion. I think very little is, in general, very little is known about the military settlement problem. And Mr. Strowitz is, yes, he's nodding his head because he is also, researching that. We are focusing on a person's displaced from the eastern borderland, but with regard to other people, which is agreed that, oh yes, they were settlers or resettlers from other regions of the world, and that's roughly it. Agnieszka Kalman from the Institute of National Remembrance in Wrocław. I have a question, and here I shall represent the devil's advocate, and the question goes to the first speaker and Joanna, because I was actually managing a research project on women at the Institute of National Remembrance that was actually made silent. I was made silent in this respect. The project was put down, so to speak. So, over all those years where I studied the history of women here in Lower Silesia, I had this impression. I would like you to refer to that. What was the very purpose and what's the contribution of the narrative that develops from the female perspective? In other words, is the choice of this narrative or your choice of the subject for your paper, what was it? Why was it? Why did you choose this particular subject? Why did you not, mention the Roma people or the Czech people or the tailors, for instance? From the traditional historiographic perspective, it should actually add variety or add to this narrative. So if it does, how? That's a question. And now from the perspective of the Emily Platte battalion members, my question is whether this narrative actually gains something based on your perspective, or is it just the same perspective of the same problem? So this female factor, well, what does it actually do? Is it value added, or it's just this extravaganza of the contemporary fashion just to carry out this type of research? Now a question to Karol with regard to repatriates. Did you ever encounter any cases of transport by these luxury means of transport, or transport of people being transported here to the region of Lower Silesia? I mean, from transport from eastern borderland, because I know of cases of, let's say, entire carriage being transported from this, Ukrainian gentry family. And then this carriage or this cart, luxury cart, was then hidden somewhere in the barn or in a shack, somewhere in the depths of Lower Silesia. Do you know of any other interesting stories of a luxury car that could, again, be hidden somewhere in this wagon or car, transported from beyond the River Bug? So I have taken hold of the microphone, so I have the power. Okay, so on a more serious note, my thesis supervisor is a person who handles history foreman, Piotr Perkowski, a professor of the Pomeranian University. So he recently has released a book on this matter, and he also authored a rather controversial book, at least in Gdańsk. That's how it was received. Gdańsk, a city made anew. So is it actually a city made anew? It started being built in 1945, obviously. My research and promotional activity, because I am promoting the history of Gdańsk for 25 years, so I'm trying to popularize or to reclaim the history of the 19th century Gdańsk. It is a city made anew. So according to me, the history of women is, to a certain extent, and still, something, the thing of a fashion, literally, especially recently. However, as far as those releases, those publications that really address this history, they aren't too many there, actually. Why is it so interesting to me? Well, I got interested in that because of the very stories of individual people, and women were so important in those local communities. And to me personally, this is important because I come from a family where there were significantly more women than men. So it seems to me that women are still waiting for their own history. And I'm not thinking about my daughter, actually about my granddaughters to come. So they deserve their history to be told from their perspective. I believe this is also a job for the current generation. Not only the researchers that do address this matter directly, this is something that really deserves to be discussed, so that those little girls, now little girls, can enter the sphere without being threatened by all those strange smirks that the members of the Emily Platte Battalion had to come across as they were moving in the ranks of the Polish People's Army holding a rifle. I'm not sure if to address other subjects it was so emotional, and I'm not going to praise any strange thesis here, but certain standards, I think this is something for us, the society, to rework this definitely, in order to understand that women have always played and will always play a major part in how the Poland's history is shaped. And I believe, irrespective of where we are, in terms of where women are, it all depends on how this world actually develops. Oh, I've just realized how longish my statement is, like a preacher. Sorry for that. No, the history of women has always been written in a strange fashion. I'm a teacher, so I started my work as a teacher. Trust me, if I sit down on this textbook, probably it would bleed. And my question was always, why I need to tell the stories, all those stories, and then, to examine all of you, dear students, based on those stories. This story should be written anew. Most certainly, every single generation writes its own history to a certain extent, and writes it anew. Without that, we wouldn't have, history of the Romans, of the 10th, of the 15th history. Everything has been already written. Well, why to continue?
Ja wiem, tylko zawsze to jest tak, ja z Gdańska jestem. W związku
Yes, I know, whatever the question was. But I'm from Gdańsk, you know. The historiography of Gdańsk was virtually absent in the 19th century. Why? Because it became a German city, well, after the Napoleon Wars, roughly speaking. So it was a place one would not write about, and if so, it was only commented in terms of its fall. So now, obviously, to tackle these documents, to process them, to translate them, to regain the awareness, that's important matter. A historian that handles this subject, sorry for saying that, but anybody who handles that subject is to a certain extent responsible for not interpreting that anew, even though I mentioned the need for new textbooks being written every single generation. It's something that is there, but people did not address, or if they did it marginally. At least from my perspective, sorry for... but because, you know, I have two granddaughters, so I do take care of that. But I have a look at them, I take a look at them, and I just think of the world they're entering, and I see some threats from the world and for the world of women in contemporary times. They did manage in 1945, however, it was a very brutal and harsh times. Well, you know, people do succeed in very different circumstances, but it's not the thing, you know, to learn to accept every single situation and try to handle them all, or rather try to exclude certain situations. Oh boy, no, I gotta give this mic away. Still opportunities to take a bit more in the foyer, because we are waiting for Karol to actually answer the question. If I may, a second question to you, actually. Yes, cars were actually subject to certain specific well, rationing systems. What about fuel? Okay, let me answer and then elaborate on that. So, first short question is no. In terms of the question, your questions, the car that could be, you know, smuggled here in some train car, it was not the case because the eastern borderland was really not motorized too much. The Republic of Poland was not too motorized, actually. And secondly, even if the Soviet army actually went there, 1939 and then 1944, there was nothing to recover. Nothing actually was saved on the shack. At least I haven't heard a story. Maybe some spare parts, used parts. I heard about the Sokol 200. You know, it was a motorcycle of Polish make, but I have no idea how it was transported into Lower Silesia. But actually, I have a story. Our repatriates could really handle well different situations. As far as smuggling cars are concerned, not only in central Poland, there is a well-known story of a certain collector of communist Poland's cars, how exotically as it may seem, who actually collected all the rarest cars that could be found in the new reality, in the post-war world, and he traded in those cars outside, and there was, you know, this journalist named Collins that bought one of those Mercedes-Benz, not the kind of a sports car as that one I showed you, thanks to this collector, a repatriate, who also dwelled in Wrocław and actually bought this Mercedes-Benz in Wrocław, and interestingly enough, sold it at the Berlin checkpoint in 1960s. And no one knows how it looked like. A Brit coming to Berlin and exchange, you know, luxury cars, well, seemingly hand to hand, actually, cash for car for cash. So that's as much as I know. As far as fuel is concerned, I think that requires a separate story, and you can also read about it in my article, because the rationing system for the fuel, at least based on what the Pioneer magazine was providing, well, the most important types of vehicles were the lorries and then, obviously, the agriculture tractors. Later on, there were Holzgas, well, the wood chip gas that fueled cars, well, still, fuel cars in North Korea, actually. Their lorries are sometimes rebuilt and converted into engines that are powered with wood-derived gas. Obviously, some of these questions find their answers in my article. Oh, it's me still to talk? Oh, sorry for that. Just 2 minutes. To add to what has already been said, why we need a history of women. It's not the point that we should turn the whole thing 180 degrees and stop talking about men, start talking about women only. But do notice the matter of education of history. Never teach school children and students about women. We don't teach about the enfranchisement, empowerment. We never give voice to the silent ones. And the remembrance of women, not about women, but of women, is also different. It's more oriented towards families, local communities, personal stories. And the official memory of women, the one that we know or know of, the one that is defined and developed by politics, the one that is described in notebooks, didn't give us the full picture. It doesn't. Because the society is composed of, roughly speaking, of men and women 50-50. But for some reason, we deprived the female half of their voice. Just as an addendum, my question was supposed to be provocative. Thanks for explanation. Thanks, Joanna. One more supplement to the speaker mentioning motorization, a very interesting and rare subject. I'm talking about former Republic of Poland. There were, races being organized and so on and so forth. But when talking about cities that were rather motorized, you're obviously right that the Second Republic of Poland was rather not too good in this respect. Only Warsaw and Lviv. And the problem of transportation of property from beyond the River Bug, it couldn't have been done, because all the carts and repatriates have to leave something, take something, but everything was according to some regulations, Yeah, you could smuggle things, but things such as aircraft or a vehicle, well, not really. Maybe a goat or some pets, maybe. But not, you couldn't really shimmer a bigger doll in. But there were letters, everything was actually clearly regulated of what could have been brought by repatriates. Just on the final note, is it really necessary to, keep proving and proving again that looking back into the past actually adds something, adds some value to our present, whether this is a history of a man or a history of a fork? Well, from that perspective, I'm absolutely sure that the research, historical and historiographical research, is substantial and legitimate. Obviously, we'll argue about that with greater or lesser success. So many different subjects brought here to the table at this perspective, but every single perspective that we touch upon enables us to better understand the perspective of the present. From this point, I would like to thank you for the discussion and for your participation, and on my own part and on behalf of the organizers, I would like to invite you to tomorrow, and I give the floor to the representative of the organizers. Some housekeeping notes on tomorrow, our meeting together at 9. But before we start the discussions, you can visit the permanent exhibition, Wrocław 1994-2016. If you want to actually attend this exhibition, we suggest that you let me know, and with a guide, you will be guided throughout this exhibition. If you need a certificate on the attendance at this conference, let me know again. I'll do my best to actually issue this certificate. And now, on behalf of the organizers, you are invited to a dinner party that will be held at the Vega Hotel. So let's meet in front of this of the depot, and let's walk. It's roughly, half a kilometer. Some of you actually are accommodated there. It's planned for 6 p.m., but if we get earlier, it'll be all right. Thank you for today. See you tomorrow.